The black ship had always been a place of mystery. A place where the unknown thrived in the dark corners of its vast hull, where the strange became the ordinary and the ordinary faded into shadows. Its crew was made up of seasoned sailors, each with their own stories, their own pasts, but even they couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The whispers had started quietly at first, so quietly, in fact, that most of the crew thought it was just the wind, the creaking of the ship, or their minds playing tricks on them. But then, they began to grow louder, more distinct, as though someone was calling out to them from somewhere deep within the ship's belly. At first, no one said anything. After all, the black ship was a place where superstition ran as deep as the ocean it sailed upon. But as the days passed, things began to get strange, too strange to ignore. It started with the instruments. First, the navigation system failed just for a moment, long enough to throw the crew into confusion. Then, it was the communications array. And after that, the lights. They flickered. At first, the engineers chalked it up to a malfunction, but it wasn't long before even the most skeptical started to wonder, was this truly a series of unfortunate coincidences, or was something else at play? And then there were the whispers. Late at night, when the ship was quiet and still, the crew began to hear faint voices. Barely audible at first, they could be mistaken for the wind, the creak of the ship, or the rustling of the waves. But as the hours passed, the voices seemed to grow clearer. They weren't just sounds, they were words, cryptic, murmured phrases that chilled the bone. Some of the crew tried to ignore it. Others grew restless, becoming more and more convinced that they were not alone aboard the black ship. The whispers were everywhere. Some said they heard them in the mess hall, a soft and distant murmur under the clinking of plates and cups. Others swore they came from the vents, traveling through the walls, creeping into their ears when they lay in their bunks. But it wasn't just the whispers that set them on edge, it was the feeling that came with them. It was as though something was watching them, something unseen but undeniably present. Every time they turned a corner, they could feel eyes upon them, like the ship itself was alive, its presence heavy and suffocating. One morning, the rumors began. Crew members were whispering to one another, a hushed excitement in their voices. Some had seen something impossible. Shadows. Shadows that moved on their own. They spoke of figures that appeared for only a split second, lurking just beyond the edge of their vision, darting away before they could get a clear look. Others spoke of an overwhelming coldness, a chill that swept through certain parts of the ship, freezing the air and leaving a trail of goosebumps behind. No one knew what to believe anymore. The practical ones claimed it was stress, the isolation of being so far from civilization. The superstitious ones pointed to the old tales, the stories of ships that vanished without a trace, of cursed vessels, and forgotten gods who demanded their due. But the strangest part? The whispers didn't seem to be coming from anywhere. No one could pinpoint the source. It wasn't the ship's mechanical hum, nor the sound of the waves crashing against the hull. It was something deeper, something ancient, something that had always been there, just beneath the surface. As the days passed, the tension began to rise. The crew members were on edge, jumpy, casting wary glances over their shoulders, listening for the whispers that seemed to follow them everywhere. Some had begun to leave their posts in the middle of their shifts, unable to bear the sense of unease that settled over them like a thick fog. Others, usually the bravest, the toughest, the most seasoned sailors among them, started to pull away from their duties, their faces pale and drawn, haunted by the strange things they had seen or thought they had seen. The captain tried to maintain order. He was a man who had seen it all: storms, pirates, disease, but even he couldn't deny that something was wrong. There was a crack in his usual calm, a flicker of doubt in his eyes when he addressed the crew. No one had seen him this shaken before. He gathered everyone together in the briefing room one night, his face grim, his voice steady but tinged with something darker. "There's no room for superstition on this ship," he said, his eyes scanning the room, looking each crew member in the eye. "We've sailed through far worse than this. But I can't ignore the reports of things happening that can't be explained. We're going to get to the bottom of this, and we're going to do it together. No one leaves their post. Not without reason." But the very next night, things took a turn. A scream echoed through the ship, a blood-curdling, unearthly sound that sent a wave of panic through the crew. It came from the lower decks, deep within the heart of the black ship. By the time the search party arrived, the crew member who had screamed was gone, vanished without a trace. The only evidence left behind was a trail of wet, dark footprints leading into the shadows. The captain ordered the crew to stay together, but it was too late. The fear had already spread. The whispers, once just a curiosity, had become a presence that everyone could feel, even if no one could explain it. Something was down there, in the deepest parts of the ship. And whatever it was awake now. The air grew thick with the feeling of impending dread, and the crew knew, whether they spoke it aloud or not, that there was no escaping it. They were not alone aboard the black ship. Something was hunting them. And the longer they stayed, the more they realized that they might not leave at all. A small group of the crew, determined to find out what was going on, ventured deep into the bowels of the ship. The air was colder than ever down there, and the shadows seemed to move with them, stretching unnaturally along the walls. Every footstep echoed in the silence, and the whispers, once faint, were now unmistakable. They were close. Then, in the dead of night, the whispers stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. For a brief moment, everything stood still. No one moved, no one breathed. And then, from the darkness, came a sound so chilling that it froze their blood in their veins. A laugh. Not a human laugh, but something darker, more ancient. It was a sound that resonated in their bones, a sound that could only be born from the darkest corners of the universe. And with it, came the realization that the whispers had not been warnings at all. They had been calling. Calling for them. The ship had been waiting. And now, it had them. What would they find in the depths of the black ship? And would they make it out alive? The black ship creaked beneath their feet as the group of sailors gathered their courage, standing just beyond the threshold of the deepest section of the ship. The walls here were covered in grime, the air thick with moisture, the faint stench of something old and decaying. It was a place few dared to venture, and even fewer had reason to. The ship's lower decks were meant for storage, for the machines that powered the vessel, and for the darkest corners of its hull, places that, for centuries, had remained untouched by human hands. The sound of their boots echoed off the metal floors, mingling with the heavy silence that seemed to press down on them like a weight. They were the brave ones, the ones who refused to believe that something as irrational as ghosts or curses could be at the heart of this mystery. The whispers had led them here, and though fear gnawed at the edges of their resolve, their determination to find answers kept them moving forward. As they descended further into the darkness, a sense of dread settled in. It was as though the very walls of the ship were closing in on them, drawing them deeper into the unknown. The sound of their footsteps grew louder in the emptiness, swallowed almost immediately by the ship's unnatural quiet. No one spoke. There was no need for words. The feeling of something watching them was all-consuming, and each one of them could feel it. The captain's order had been clear: find the source of the whispers, find what had been causing the strange phenomena. They couldn't just wait for the ship to take them under, they had to confront whatever lurked in its depths. The deeper they went, the more unsettling it became. The flickering lights above their heads seemed to grow dimmer with each step, casting long, distorted shadows along the walls. The air itself seemed to be thickening, like it was filled with something that shouldn't be there. They reached the maintenance room. A low hum emanated from the array of dormant machines. The room smelled of oil, dust, and rust. A set of heavy pipes ran along the walls, and strange, unfamiliar markings were carved into the floor, their meaning lost to time. Some of the crew members began to feel the hairs on their necks stand on end, their unease turning into something more primal, something they couldn't shake. "What do you think this is?" one of them muttered, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking any louder might invite something worse into the room. He was new to the black ship, a young man with too much bravado for his own good, and even he had begun to sense the danger they were in. "Don't know," another replied, his voice tight. "But I don't think it's just the ship messing with us. We're not alone down here." They all knew the truth now: Even if none of them dared to speak it aloud, whatever they were dealing with, it was not something that could be explained away with simple mechanical failure or human error. There was something supernatural at work here, something ancient and powerful, something that had been waiting. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, until one of the crew members, a seasoned officer who had sailed through storms, piracy, and countless other dangers, suddenly stiffened. His eyes widened, and he looked around frantically, as though searching for something just out of view. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely a tremor in the oppressive stillness. The others froze. "What do you mean?" one of them asked. The officer's eyes flicked toward a corner of the room, and he took a step back, his hand reaching instinctively for the weapon at his side. The others turned, trying to see what he was seeing, but the shadows were too thick. And then there it was. A faint noise, barely audible, almost lost to the air. A whisper. But this time, it wasn't distant. It wasn't in the walls or the pipes. It was right in front of them. One of the crew members reached out, his hand trembling as he brushed it against the wall. He pulled it back quickly, recoiling as though he had touched something scalding hot. The whispers had stopped. But not the shadows. The shadows were moving. No one spoke now. No one dared to break the silence, for fear that doing so might invite the darkness to claim them. The air felt colder suddenly, the chill creeping into their bones. They were standing in the heart of the ship, and it was as though the very walls themselves were alive. The shadows seemed to writhe and twist, as if they were made of something more than just light and dark. There was something primal about them, something that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. The young officer, the one who had first noticed the presence, began to edge toward the corner of the room. His eyes were wide with fear, but his hand was steady on the handle of his weapon. The others followed cautiously, but they could feel their hearts pounding in their chests, each step echoing like a drumbeat in the silence. It was too quiet, too unnatural. Then, with a sudden movement, the shadows flared up, stretching across the walls like dark tendrils. They coiled and twisted, moving with a mind of their own. One of the crew members shouted, a guttural cry of fear, and then he was gone, disappearing into the darkness as if the shadows themselves had swallowed him whole. His scream echoed in their ears for only a moment before it was cut off, leaving only the eerie silence. The remaining crew members froze, their blood running cold. The air was thick with the weight of the unknown, and none of them could bring themselves to move. "What the hell was that?" the officer whispered, his voice shaking with disbelief. His eyes were wide, staring at the spot where their friend had just been. There was no sign of him, no trace, no blood, no sound. Just the thick, suffocating shadows. The captain, who had been standing at the back of the group, took a step forward, his hand gripping the hilt of his own weapon. "We need to leave," he said, his voice low and strained. "Now." But as he turned toward the exit, he stopped. The door, the only way out, was gone. The space that had once led them to safety had been swallowed by the shadows. There was no way out. The crew stood frozen, their breaths shallow and quick, as the shadows seemed to grow thicker around them. They could hear the whispers again, this time louder, more insistent, as if the ship itself was speaking to them. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the ship groaned in protest. The floor beneath their feet seemed to shift, as though the very ship was alive, shifting and turning like a beast in pain. "This isn't happening," the officer muttered under his breath. "This isn't real." But it was real. They were trapped, and whatever was lurking in the shadows was closing in on them, drawing them deeper into the ship's heart, where there were no answers, only darkness. A heavy silence fell over them again. But this time, it was broken by something far worse. A laugh. It was low, guttural, and filled with a kind of malice that sent a chill through every bone in their bodies. It was the same laugh they had heard before, deep, ancient, and unmistakably evil. The shadows moved closer. And the whispers grew louder, wrapping around them like chains. And then, just as they thought they could take no more, they heard something even worse, a voice, a whisper, soft but unmistakable, coming from behind them. They turned as one, their eyes wide with terror, to see nothing. Only the thick darkness pressing in, suffocating them. The voice came again, this time louder and closer. It wasn't from behind. It was coming from within. "We've been waiting for you." And with that, the darkness took them. The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. "We've been waiting for you." The voice was soft, barely a murmur, yet it felt like an iron chain pulling them deeper into the darkness. For a moment, no one moved. No one dared to. The shadows were closing in, stretching out in every direction, as if the very walls of the ship were alive. The temperature dropped, and every breath they took felt like it was made of ice. Their skin prickled with the sensation of unseen eyes upon them. And then, in an instant, the whispers became more than just a noise, they became a presence. They could feel them now, wrapping around their minds, slipping through their thoughts. It was as if the ship itself was alive, speaking to them, to each of them individually. They could hear their own names, whispered in the dark, but not by their fellow crew members. These whispers were far older, far darker than anything human. The captain stepped forward, his voice steady despite the cold sweat running down his back. "Stay close. We need to stay together." But even his words seemed to fade as they were swallowed by the overwhelming darkness, like they had never been spoken at all. The shadows were everywhere now, clinging to the corners, crawling along the walls. It was as if the black ship itself was sinking into the abyss, taking them along with it. And then, without warning, the shadows shifted, pulling away from the walls, pooling together in the center of the room. There, in the blackest of spaces, something moved. It was not human. It was not even alive, not in any way they could understand. The figure that emerged from the darkness was a mass of swirling shapes, ever-changing, never solid. It was a thing that existed only in the edges of their vision, something too large to comprehend, yet too close to ignore. The crew stood frozen, unable to tear their eyes away, even though every instinct screamed at them to run. The figure seemed to be watching them, waiting, as if measuring their fear. And then, without warning, it reached out toward them, fingers of darkness stretching through the air, long and endless, like tendrils of smoke. One of the crew members, a young man who had only joined the ship a few months ago, took a step back, his eyes wide with terror. "I can't." His voice faltered as his feet moved against his will. The shadows seemed to drag him toward the center of the room, his body moving as if guided by some unseen force. "Help me!" he screamed, but no one moved. They were paralyzed, their minds clouded by the suffocating presence that seemed to press in on them from all sides. Before they could react, the shadows closed in, swallowing him whole. There was no sound, no struggle, no cry for help. One moment he was there, and the next, he was gone, consumed by the darkness that clung to the walls like a living thing. The captain's face went pale. He took a step forward, as if to reach for the young man, but the shadows recoiled, pulling back into themselves as if they were mocking his attempts. It was as if they had all forgotten something crucial, something they hadn't even realized was missing until now. There was no escape. "We can't just stand here," the officer whispered, his voice hoarse. "We need to find a way out. Now." But the room seemed to twist around them, the walls bending and distorting as though they were no longer inside the black ship at all. The very structure of the ship had become fluid, like it was being reshaped, reformed by something unseen, something ancient and powerful. The whispers began again, louder now, overwhelming. They were not just in their ears, they were in their heads, in their thoughts, everywhere. They could no longer tell where their own voices ended and the whispers began. The words were no longer fragmented, no longer strange. They were clear, urgent, demanding. "The ship has chosen you," the voice repeated, growing louder and more insistent. "The ship has chosen you." One of the crew members dropped to his knees, clutching his head, his face contorted in pain. "I can't make it stop," he screamed, his body shaking violently. But the whispers didn't stop. They became louder, more frantic, as if the ship itself was feeding on their fear, growing stronger with each passing second. Suddenly, the walls seemed to collapse inward, and the crew found themselves in a new part of the ship, a place none of them recognized. The floor was covered in strange symbols, etched deep into the metal, glowing faintly with a dim, sickly light. The air was thick with an unfamiliar scent, something ancient and decayed. The officer, who had barely managed to stay standing, nodded shakily. The rest of the crew, though terrified, followed suit, moving toward the altar. The symbols on the floor seemed to shift and change as they stepped closer, their shapes twisting in the dim light, like they were alive. The air grew colder, heavier with every step they took. But before they could reach the altar, the shadows surged forward, faster than they had ever moved before. The figure in the center of the room stepped forward, its form shifting and flickering, as if it were not entirely solid. Its eyes glowed brighter, and the growl grew louder, a sound that seemed to shake the very walls of the ship. "Stop!" the captain shouted, holding up a hand, though he wasn't sure if the figure could hear him. "We don't have to do this." "We don't." But the figure did not stop. It lunged forward, its form blurring with the speed of its movement. The crew scattered, some of them falling to the floor in their panic, but the captain kept his eyes on the altar. He had to get to it. That was the key, he knew it. Just as the figure reached him, a loud crash echoed through the room. The altar exploded into light, and the ship groaned as if in pain. The shadows recoiled, drawn back by the sudden surge of energy. The captain saw his chance. He darted forward, reaching for the altar, his hand trembling as it brushed against the cold metal surface. The symbols on the floor pulsed with light, and he could feel something ancient, something powerful, stirring beneath his fingers. He slammed his palm down on the altar, and the world seemed to tilt. A blast of energy shot out from the altar, knocking him back. The ship shook violently, the walls rattling, the floor buckling under the force of whatever had been unleashed. The figure screamed a sound that was not quite human, not quite anything, and then, with a violent flash of light, it was gone. The room fell silent once more. The crew lay scattered on the floor, their bodies bruised and battered from the shockwave. The captain groaned, pushing himself to his feet. His heart was still racing, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The altar had been their only chance, and they had taken it. But at what cost? "We did it," one of the crew members whispered, barely able to stand. "It's over." But the captain wasn't so sure. He looked around, his eye scanning the room for any sign of the shadows. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the echoes of their voices, the stillness of the ship. And then, from deep within the bowels of the ship, came a sound, a soft whisper, almost like a sigh. "No," the captain muttered, his voice thick with dread. "It's not over." The lights flickered above them, casting long shadows across the floor. The air grew thick again, charged with an energy they couldn't see but could feel. The ship's groan was louder now, almost like a growl, as if the entire vessel was alive, breathing, waiting. Suddenly, a blinding flash of light erupted from the walls, filling the room with searing brightness. The crew shielded their eyes, but the light was too intense. It burned through them, like it was tearing at their very souls. The whispers began again, louder now, almost deafening. And then, in the center of the room, a figure appeared. It was not the same shadowy figure as before. This one was different, its form shifting and warping with every passing second. It was tall, its outline flickering like a broken image, too strange to comprehend. But it was clear that this was not something human. This was not something they could fight. The captain's heart sank as he realized the truth. The black ship hadn't just chosen them, it had claimed them. The whispers were not the ship's voice, not its will. They were the voices of those who had come before them, those who had been lost to the ship's darkness. The ship was feeding on their fear, feeding on their souls. The captain stepped back, his mind racing. "We need to get out," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if anyone could hear him. But it was too late. The figure stretched its arm out toward them, and the shadows surged once again. They closed in on the crew, faster than before, as if the ship had decided to claim them all. And just before the darkness consumed them, the captain caught a glimpse of something, a symbol, glowing faintly on the floor, the same symbol they had seen before, the one that had been etched into the figure's chest. And then, the lights went out. Completely. The darkness pressed in from all sides, suffocating them. The air was thick, like breathing through a wet cloth, and the once familiar hum of the black ship had died away. In the silence, the crew felt as though they were floating in an endless void, caught between dimensions. It was as if the ship itself had abandoned them to whatever fate awaited in the shadows. The captain's mind was racing. He could feel the weight of the others' eyes on him, the silent plea for him to lead, to give them a way out. But what was left to lead them to? The black ship had become a labyrinth of nightmares, a place where nothing seemed real and everything was twisted. The figure had vanished, but the feeling of its presence lingered, as though it was still there, watching them from the dark corners of their minds. And then, as if summoned by their collective fear, a sound broke through the oppressive silence. A whisper. Soft at first, like the faintest rustle of wind, but it grew louder with each passing second. It wasn't the voice of the figure they had encountered earlier. It wasn't even the whispers that had haunted them since they first set foot on the ship. No, this was something new, something ancient. The captain's breath caught in his throat as the whisper became a voice, clear and unmistakable. It wasn't coming from any of them. It was coming from the walls, from the very heart of the ship itself. Leave. Now. Or stay forever. The words echoed through their minds, reverberating off the walls of the ship, filling every corner of the room with a presence that was both comforting and terrifying. The crew froze. They had heard these words before, hadn't they? The whispers had been growing louder, more urgent. And now, this voice, this warning. It was almost as if the ship was giving them one last chance, one final opportunity to escape before it claimed them completely. The captain's heart raced. He wanted to believe it was just a hallucination, just the stress and fear getting to him, but deep down, he knew the truth. This wasn't just a ship. It was something more, something older than they could possibly comprehend. And whatever it was, it had taken them in, dragged them into its depths, and now it was offering them a choice. One of the crew members, trembling, spoke up, his voice hoarse from fear. What? What does it mean? Leave? How? The captain didn't have an answer. He turned toward the altar, his eye scanning the symbols etched into the floor, still glowing faintly in the dark. There was something familiar about them now, something that tugged at his memory. He had seen these symbols before. On the walls. On the figure. And now, on the altar. It wasn't just decoration. It was a key. A key to understanding what was happening here. "We need to finish what we started," the captain said, his voice steadier than he felt. The altar. There's something we missed. But as he moved toward it, a shadow flickered in his peripheral vision, and he froze. The walls seemed to shift, warping in a way that wasn't natural. The glow from the symbols dimmed and then flared back to life, brighter than before. The temperature in the room dropped even further, and they could see their breath in the air. Suddenly, the whispers returned, louder now, crashing against their minds like waves in a storm. They were no longer just words, they were commands, demands, desperate pleas for them to understand. "The ship has chosen you," the voice repeated, but this time it was different. It wasn't the ship speaking to them. It was something else, something that had been there all along, waiting, watching, feeding. The captain's mind reeled. The realization hit him like a thunderclap. The ship hadn't just chosen them, it had been waiting for them. They were part of its design, part of its plan. They had been drawn into the black ship's orbit long before they ever boarded. The voices, the whispers, the shadows, they were all part of a greater scheme. A scheme that had been set in motion long ago. He turned back to the crew, his face pale with the weight of this revelation. This ship is not just a vessel. It's a living thing, a consciousness. And it has been waiting for us, for this moment. It's trying to make us part of it, part of its. It's collective. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and suffocating. The crew stared at him, disbelief etched on their faces. Could it really be true? Had they truly stumbled into something beyond their understanding? Before anyone could respond, the ground beneath them trembled. The ship groaned, as if it were in pain, and the walls began to warp even more, twisting and bending in ways that defied logic. The shadows in the corners of the room swirled, forming into something more solid, more defined. The figure reappeared, this time different. It wasn't just a shadow anymore, it was a being, an entity, standing tall before them, its form shifting in and out of focus. Its eyes glowed with a deep, unsettling light, and its body seemed to ripple and distort with every movement. "It's time," the figure said, its voice both malevolent and ancient. "You have a choice now. Leave, or stay. But know this: if you leave, the ship will never forget. It will find you. It will always find you." The crew recoiled, their bodies tense with fear, but the captain stood his ground. He could feel the pull, the temptation to give in to the darkness, to embrace the unknown. It would be so easy, so simple. But he knew that would be the end, not just for him, but for all of them. "We leave," the captain said, his voice firm. "We're leaving this ship. Whatever it takes." The figure's eyes flared with anger, and for a moment, the ship seemed to tremble in response. The shadows surged forward, but then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they receded. The figure's form flickered, and the glowing symbols on the floor began to fade. The ship groaned, its walls rattling as if in protest. The captain stepped forward, his hand reaching for the altar once more. This time, when his fingers brushed against the cold surface, the ship did not resist. The symbols lit up with an intense, blinding light, and the walls of the room began to dissolve, falling away like dust. The air shifted, the temperature rising, and for the first time in what felt like forever, they could breathe. The crew stumbled, disoriented but alive, as the ship's hold on them finally released. The altar flared one final time, and then, with a deafening roar, the darkness was gone. The room was empty, the oppressive presence of the ship vanishing into nothingness. They were back. The crew stood in a new, unfamiliar place, a vast expanse of empty space stretching out before them. The black ship was gone, vanished as if it had never existed. And yet, they knew it wasn't over. Not truly. The echoes of the whispers lingered in their minds, a constant reminder that the ship would never fully release them. The darkness had followed them. It was still there, just beyond the edge of their perception. But for now, they were free. As they looked out into the stars, the captain felt a strange sense of peace. They had survived. They had faced the darkness and come out on the other side. But there was still so much they didn't understand. So much they had yet to discover. The black ship was gone, but its influence, its presence was still with them.